Hey there, wicked listeners, and welcome to episode 4 of Wicked Crimes. As always, I'm your host, Jan Ruet. If you're enjoying this podcast, please remember to follow, review, and tell a friend. You can also join us on social media. We're on Twitter under the handle @CrimesSouth, and on Facebook we have a group named Wicked Crimes. I know this episode is late, again. While I was busy writing the script for this episode, I did something, I still don't know what, and I ended up accidentally deleting all my research into the episode. So halfway through, I had to compile my research again, and it led to it being a bit late. But I promise, this Friday you'll have your next episode as scheduled. Mainly because I am not here on this Friday. I'm going away for the weekend, so it needs to be recorded and researched in advance. But now, let's get into episode 4. The Serial Crimes of Bheki Simelane.
Please be advised that this podcast contains content that could be harmful to some listeners. This includes, but is not limited to, strong language and graphic descriptions of violence, sexual activities, assault, and death. This podcast also engages in discussion regarding various religion, spiritual beliefs, and practices, some of which might be harmful or triggering for some listeners. Please reconsider before consuming this content. The information contained within this podcast is mainly gathered from news articles and official court documents where available. Should you have any more information, or if you know of any incorrect information in this content, please feel free to contact the host through the email found in the show notes.
Today's case is another case where the victims become nothing more than names in the story of their killer. The majority of research in this case came from the judgment made by the judge. Outside of that, I found very little news articles regarding the event and absolutely nothing about the victims or who they were. But I still think it's important to tell their stories. Each victim in this case became a victim because they were attempting to better their circumstances. But perhaps not in the way you would expect. Each person here had found issues in their lives, which they felt could be solved with the help of a spiritual leader. Imagine you have something in your life that is bothering you. So, you go to speak to your pastor, priest, shaman, coven leader, or like in this case, your sangoma. A sangoma is a traditional healer and actually quite a common occurrence in South Africa. Sangomas are trusted to provide spiritual, mental, and even medical assistance. They are normally quite trusted within their communities and are believed to be able to commune with the ancestors of their patients and communities. This means that sangomas usually carry a form of credibility to them. They also prescribe traditional medicines for minor ailments, or magical mixtures that we call muti, for issues that they believe their muti can assist with. This can be something as simple as curing insomnia, or something more complicated like helping to remove a curse that has been placed on someone. The latter is also the reason why sangomas are often met with fear and anger. It is believed that they have the ability to curse someone, to turn their ancestors against them, or a variety of otherworldly attacks. Then, there is also the fact that there are many sangomas who give the rest of their community a bad name. In South Africa, there is a type of murder that is unfortunately way more common than anyone would like. These are called muti murders. This is when someone is murdered either during the process of or for the purposes of harvesting their body parts in order to be used as muti in a ritual. The targets of these murders are often people who have albinism. The results of this is that sangomas are made with either overwhelming trust or overwhelming fear wherever they go. Before we get into this case, all the victims in the case had two names. So, while I will initially give their full names when talking about them, I will then use only one of their names moving forward, just to make it a bit easier to keep track of who is who. Okay, now that we have the background of the case sorted out, we can get into it. Our case begins on the 16th of November 2013. Dungan Twala had just received a frantic phone call from his brother's girlfriend. Henry Themba Twala had left the home earlier that day, but at some point, he had stopped responding to his girlfriend, and this made her worried about his safety. Dungan immediately sprang to action and started attempting to find his brother. He checked in with friends, family members, and even hospitals. When none of this produced any information on Themba's whereabouts, Dungan reported him as missing to the police. It would take the police 2 days to find Themba. On the 18th of November 2013, his body was discovered in a river. An autopsy had been done on Themba's body, and while my research on this is not clear, from what I can gather, Themba's death was ruled as natural causes. Dungan and Themba's other siblings did not buy this. Themba had been in good health prior to his death. Themba's family decided to look for answers on their own, and they turned to the sangoma that Themba had been consulting for years. This is how Themba's family came to meet Bheki Simelane. After consulting with him, Simelane told the family that he would be able to assist them. His first step was to use bones as a form of divination. This works more or less as you've seen in the movies. He would throw the bones and then interpret the way they fell in order to garner certain information from them. After doing so, he told the family that they were correct. Themba's death had not been natural. He told them that Themba had been followed and that his killers were in possession of his car and making their way towards Mozambique. He then gave the family muti to wash Themba's clothes with and to spray on his yard and his property. He then told the family that he would be able to perform a ritual on Themba's body that would allow Themba to take revenge on his attackers. This would only cost the family 2,000 rand, which is approximately $110 or €100. The family agreed and paid Simelane his money. A few days later, he made his way to the morgue. The family met him there and they observed a ritual. This ritual consisted of Simelane making several cuts all over Themba's body, including on his tongue. He then placed 2 knives in Themba's hands and informed the family that this would allow Themba to take revenge on his murderers. The next day, Themba was buried. Another couple of days later, Dungan was contacted by Simelane, who informed him that he had more information on Themba. Dungan was unable to speak to Simelane at that moment, and he attempted to call him back regarding this a little while later. To Dungan's surprise, a police officer answered the phone and told him that Simelane had been arrested for being in possession of Themba's car, which had been reported stolen after Themba's death. Okay, let's jump back a little to the day of 16 November 2013, when Themba went missing. That day, Themba had consulted with Simelane, sharing some issues with him and asking for assistance. Simelane prepared some muti for Themba to inhale, gave him a change of clothing, and then gave Themba some more muti with the instruction of going to a nearby river and bathing in it. Simelane accompanied Themba to the river, watched him start to bathe, then got into Themba's car and drove away. This is the same river where Themba's body would be found 2 days later. In the days following Themba's death, Simelane made his way to his aunt Sipiwe's home. Here, he told her that the red Volkswagen Polo he arrived with was a new car that he had bought. He then told his aunt that the road to his own home was simply far too poor of quality to drive on, and he asked if he could keep the car there for a few days. When a couple of days later the car was still sitting in her garage, Sipiwe asked her nephew if he would be able to assist her. She needed to pick up her children in eMalahleni, about 200 kilometers away from Mbombela where she lived. Simelane and Themba both lived about 40 kilometers away from Sipiwe, in an area known as the Chochocho Trust. Simelane told his aunt that he would be willing to drive her to pick up the children and come back, as long as she provided him with petrol money for the trip. At 5 a.m. on the morning of 13 November 2013, Simelane, his aunt Sipiwe, and her daughter got into the car and made their way to eMalahleni. The trip would take them roughly 2.5 hours. Once there, they picked up her children and started to make their way back. On their way back, however, a police officer noticed the car and realized that it matched the description of the car that had been reported as stolen. The car was pulled over, and after verifying it is indeed the car they were looking for, officers took all the adults in the car into custody. I have no idea what the story is that Simelane told officers, or to Themba's family, but eventually the public prosecutor would instruct officers not to pursue any charges against Simelane or his aunt based on a lack of evidence. Themba's death and the theft of his car was deemed as solved, and their story was left there. A couple of months later, on Valentine's Day of 2014, Sibongile Sithole reported her husband, Mandla Sithole, missing. Mandla had left their home at 5 a.m., and Sibongile never heard from him or saw him again. Mandla's nephew was a sergeant in the police, so Sibongile contacted him as well and asked him to help her with his uncle's search. Sergeant Zakle Sithole did so immediately. The first thing the sergeant and his fellow SAPS officers did was to ask Sibongile to obtain her husband's phone statements from his service provider. It took a few days, but she was able to do so. Mandla's nephew, Sergeant Sithole, placed the call to the last number that Mandla had phoned. Would you like to take a guess who answered the phone? If you said Simelane, you would be entirely correct. Sergeant Sithole spoke to Simelane, who even went as far as giving the sergeant directions to his own home. Sibongile accompanied her husband's nephew, but when they arrived at Simelane's home, he was not there. How it happened is not clear, but just moments later they found themselves at a car wash nearby. I can only theorize that the car wash was connected to a petrol station or a shopping center, and the pair had decided to stop for fuel or something to drink. But it was here that they noticed Mandla's car at the car wash. As they made their way over to the car, they noticed two young boys approaching the car as well, with the car keys in hand. When questioned, the boys told them that Simelane had given them the car keys so that they could fetch some of his personal belongings. The information on what happened next is not entirely clear. What I do know is that 2 days later, Simelane phoned Sergeant Satole and told him that he had more information for him regarding Mandla. I can only assume that this meant that in those 2 days, police had questioned Simelane. Sergeant Satole made his way to Simelane and met him at his home. I have no idea what the conversation that took place was, or what information Simelane shared with the sergeant. But the following day, on the 20th of February 2014, Mandla's body was discovered in a latrine pit quite close to Simelane's home. Then, 9 days later, Sibongile was called into the police station for an identity parade. With a twist. She would be on the wrong side of the glass. Sibongile, along with 9 other women, were in the lineup. On the other side of the glass was none other than Simelane. Simelane had failed to identify Sibongile in this lineup. The reason for this will become clearer when we discuss the trial, but I'm still not entirely certain what Simelane had told the police, especially since almost a month later, on the 26th of March 2014, Simelane was again arrested, and apparently had been arrested for Mandla's murder, according to one article I found. However, there was yet again not enough evidence to secure a conviction, and Simelane was let go. At the end of that year, on the 28th of December 2014, a body was discovered in a forest, close to a stream, either at or near a dumping site in Kabokweni, around 30 kilometers from Simelane's home, and the area where our other 2 victims had lost their lives. Next to the body was a plastic milk container. The body would later be identified as Pullen Henry Mhlongo. I don't have much information on the investigation into Pullen's death. What I do know is that Pullen's brother had gone to his home that same day. There, he had water running inside the home, which was later identified as a leaky geyser. An autopsy was done on Pullen and found that he had hypertensive heart disease. His death appeared to be from natural causes. The only odd thing was that his car was missing. It took a few days for the family to realize this, which I can completely understand if you take into account the amount of planning and paperwork that occurs between someone's death and their funeral, especially when it's unexpected. The family could also in those first days have thought that the car may have been parked somewhere safe, and only realized something was odd when police released Pullen's personal items and his car keys were not in there. On the 2nd of January, Pullen's car was officially reported as stolen. 10 days later, an officer traveling on the R528 noticed the car. The R528 is a main route which connects to both the area where Pullen lived and where Simelane had lived. The driver of the car was none other than Simelane, and he was arrested. Simelane told officers that Pullen had lent the car to him, and without anyone to say otherwise, the car was repossessed, and Simelane once again walked away unscathed. Since Pullen's death was ruled natural causes, and his car recovered with a plausible story and no issue, there was no further investigation into the matter, so we don't have much information. The next time this case picks up is on the 15th of February 2016, more than a year later. Inika Ndlovu and her son were at home. Before we continue, I found some information that made note that Inika's son may have been a minor at this time. He also survived what was about to happen. But because he was 18 by the time the case concluded, I managed to find his real name. Out of respect for him, and the fact that he may have been a minor at the time of surviving this ordeal, I'll be using a different name for him than his real name. We will be calling him Innocent, because it's a common name in South Africa, and because that's who he is. At some point during the course of the afternoon, Inika received a phone call. After the phone call, she told Innocent that they would be receiving a visitor at some point. At around 8 p.m., Inika told Innocent to open the gate. Their visitor had arrived. Innocent found this odd, since even though his parents were separated, his mother never received visitors this late. When Innocent saw who the visitor was, however, he felt a bit more at ease. He had seen this man before. This man had been in his home before, and he knew that his mother had been at this man's home. This man was a spiritual advisor that he and his mother trusted completely. This man was Simelane. As I mentioned before, sangomas are often consulted when someone is going through a difficult time. A separation and divorce is definitely one of those times. Spiritually and emotionally, Inika would have required support at the very least. So, consulting someone like Simelane would be entirely natural for her and her teenage son. Simelane entered the home and he and Inika struck up a conversation in the kitchen. Innocent left them there and made his way to his bedroom to get his cell phone. When he returned to the kitchen, Simelane had produced 2 plastic containers with a liquid mixture in them. Inika was busy finishing up her drink, and Simelane handed the second mixture to Innocent. Innocent was told that this mixture of mood tea would assist both him and his mother with their problems. A few minutes after drinking his mixture, Innocent started to feel bad. He thought it must be due to the busy day that he had, so he decided to go lay down on his bed. He quickly lost consciousness. When Innocent finally regained his consciousness, he attempted to get up. This is when he discovered that his hands and feet were tied with what appeared to be shoelaces. Innocent tried to yell out for someone to help him, but suddenly found himself unable to do so. Throughout the night, he would regain and lose consciousness several times. Around 6 a.m. on the next morning, the 16th of February, Inika's father, Abson, was awoken by his phone ringing about 3 kilometers away. When Abson answered his phone, he found a police officer on the other side of the line. The officer informed Abson that they had received calls about screaming coming from his daughter's home. Without hesitation, Abson agreed to meet the police at his daughter's home. When they arrived, Abson used his key to unlock the front gate. He and the police made their way to the front door. Here, they knocked, and after receiving no answer, they tried the door. It was locked, and Abson did not have a key for this door. The decision was made to break down the door, and they proceeded inside. Once inside, they heard noises coming from Innocent's room. Attempting to enter his room, they discovered that this door was also locked. Again, the group decided to break down the door. When they finally entered the room, they found Innocent on his bed, tied up and covered in his own feces, but he was still alive. They would quickly make their way to Inika's room. Again, the door was locked and broken down. Upson discovered his daughter, laying face down on a blanket next to her bed. When they checked for a pulse, they discovered her body cold. She did not survive. Innocent was washed and taken to a nearby clinic. From here, he was transferred to a hospital and told officers what had occurred the previous day. That same day, police managed to track down Inika's car that was missing from her home. When police tracked down the car, it was standing under a tree in a property belonging to a woman by the name of Marina. Officers informed Marina that the car in her property was stolen and that someone was killed during the theft of the car. Marina was surprised. Her employer had dropped off the car the previous day and had told her that he had purchased the car. Marina was working as a domestic worker for Simelane and his girlfriend. Now, on to Innocent's version of events, and Simelane's domestic worker telling them that he had left the car there, where investigation began. There was a major difference between this case and the previous cases. Not only did someone survive this ordeal, but for once it was clear that there was foul play involved. When police started looking into Simelane, they quickly found out about his previous arrests, how the cases were similar to each other, especially in regards to Simelane being in possession of a deceased person's property directly after their death. Simelane was questioned several times and eventually taken into custody. While in custody, he made some incriminating statements and was taken on several pointing out exercises where he showed officers certain locations of where some of the victims had been killed and where he had prepared the muti mixtures that he had given them. Simelane would later claim these statements and exercises were done under duress. He claimed that he was assaulted by officers and told what to say and where to point to. We will cover those claims in a moment. Simelane was arrested and arraigned on 9 counts. 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of aggravated robbery, and 1 count of attempted murder. He pled not guilty to all charges. Before the trial started, the prosecutor addressed the court. In his address, he informed the court that the state would be relying on circumstantial and similar fact evidence while pursuing a conviction. This meant that the state would not try to prove that Simelane had actually murdered each victim, but rather that they would prove that there is no other explanation than Simelane murdering these people. But there was a pattern of events that implicates Simelane. This is extremely risky, because it means that if the defense can prove a sliver of reasonable doubt on any case, the entire case against Simelane could fall apart. Now, I know you're probably feeling that I've only given you a part of the story so far, and I did. The reason for doing so is that I want you to understand the facts of what had occurred, as we know and can prove it, before we look at what investigators found and determined in their investigations and what the state alleged. We'll now look into the testimony of several witnesses. They'll be grouped into what victim's case they are testifying about. After that, we'll look into the 2 trials that took place within this trial, and then we'll cover Simelane's testimony and his version of events. Finally, we'll look into the judge's ruling and how we got there. So bear with me. In a moment, you'll have the full story and understand exactly what happened. The first witnesses who took the stand all testified about Themba Twala's death. Themba's 2 brothers, Gangan and William, both took the stand. They testified to how Themba's girlfriend had contacted them and informed them that Themba was missing. They also testified on the post-mortem that found that Themba had died of natural causes, how this led them to meeting Simelane, and what rituals he performed after being contacted by them, including the divination during which Simelane told them the perpetrators were leaving South Africa and making their way to Mozambique in Themba's car, as well as how much he charged them. Perhaps more importantly, they testified on Themba's health prior to his death. According to them, Themba had been in good health. Simelane's aunt, Sipiwe, also took the stand. She told her story to the court about how Simelane had arrived at her home with a car, told her he had purchased it, stored it there for several days, agreed to drive her around, and subsequently got them arrested. After this, a neighbor of Simelane also testified. This neighbor told how Simelane had told him about buying a new car, and that he had even accompanied Simelane to the car and driven in it with him. The purpose of all these testimonies were to establish certain facts. The first of the facts was that Simelane had previously had contact with Themba prior to his death. Themba and Simelane had known each other. Then, that Simelane was attempting to mislead them about the whereabouts of the car. But Themba had been in seemingly good health in the time leading up to his death. And finally, that Simelane was not only in possession of Themba's car from the day of Themba's death, but that he had also immediately told his friends and family that he had purchased the car and was the legal owner, and that he had kept the charade up until he was arrested for being in possession of the stolen car. The next witness to take the stand would testify in regards to the death of Mandla Sithole. The first person to take the stand was Sibongile Sithole, Mandla's wife. She testified to the day of Mandla's disappearance, how he had left the house that morning, how she eventually reported him missing, and the process that followed in which they discovered that Mandla had contacted Simelane on the day of his death, and how they made their way to his home and eventually found Mandla's car close to Simelane's home. When asked, Sibongile said that she did not know that Mandla was consulting with Simelane, but she had never met Simelane or the boys who were in possession of the car keys when they found the car. This would be important information to have for when Simelane makes his statement about Mandla's death. Sibongile also testified that Mandla was in good health before his death. The next person to take the stand was Mandla's nephew, Sergeant Sithole. He testified to Sibongile contacting him, how he assisted in the investigation, tracked down Simelane and Mandla's car, as well as to the phone call from Simelane, in which Simelane told the sergeant he had more information. When Sergeant Sithole started his testimony as to the conversation between the two of them on that day, the judge stopped him from providing his evidence any further, since it might be inadmissible. The judge first had to deal with two trials within this trial to determine whether this and certain other information would be admissible. We'll get to that in a moment. With these testimonies against certain facts were proven. First, that there was evidence that Mandla had been in contact with Simelane on the day of his death. Secondly, that Mandla had been in seemingly good health prior to his death. And lastly, that it is credible to believe that Simelane had been in possession of Mandla's vehicle since the time of his death. After this, the court moved focus onto Henry Pullen Mhlongo's death. Pulen's brother Kaiser took the stand and testified on the last time he saw his brother. But his brother was in good health at that time and still in possession of his own car. Then, a constable in the SAPS took the stand and testified how he had seen Pulen's car on the highway, recognized it as stolen, pulled the driver over, and arrested Simelane as the driver of the stolen car. Lastly, a man named Sipho Mhlongo took the stand. Sipho had no relation to Pulen as far as I can find, despite sharing a last name. Sipho, however, was a traditional healer or sangoma. He testified that Pulen had consulted with him, but that he had not been able to deal with Pulen's troubles, and ended up referring Pulen to someone else, none other than Simelane. Again, in the testimony, 3 facts were established. Simelane had contact with the deceased prior to his death. The deceased was in good health prior to his death. Simelane was found in possession of the deceased car after his death. The same 3 facts had been proven in all cases so far. Themba, Mandla, and Pulen all had these very specific events in common prior and after their death. On its own, these facts could have been pure coincidence. After all, Simelane was a traditional healer. It was not entirely out there to believe that Simelane would come into contact with several people in his lifetime who would pass away. He also had a plausible reason for being in possession of their cars after their deaths, which we'll cover a bit more when we look at his testimony. The point of establishing these facts is to prove that while on each individual occasion, Simelane's explanation of being in possession of a deceased person's property, but while being questionable, was still plausible. However, when it became a pattern, it started to move from questionable to suspicious. The next witnesses testified in regards to Inika Ndlovu's murder and the attempted murder of her son. Inika's son took the stand first. He told the court of the events of the day, how his mother had told him they would get a visitor, how that visitor was Simelane, how he had given each of them a muti mixture to drink, how he had felt ill after drinking this mixture, and then fallen asleep, only to wake up and find his hands and feet tied up. Innocent also testified to a few other facts. But his mother's car was in the garage when he went to bed. But his mother had owned a Nokia Asha cell phone at the time, and but in the days prior to, and until the moment he had gone to bed, his mother had been in good health. Next, Inika's father took the stand and told the court of how he was contacted by the police, how he helped them to gain access to the home and individual rooms, discovered his grandson and then his daughter's body, and that Inika's car had been gone when he arrived there that morning. A piece of absence testimony that stood out to me was that he noted that no keys were found at the home. Absent noted that all the windows in the house had burglar bars attached to them, and that if the people who are inside the house did not have any keys, they would not have been able to leave their rooms, never mind the house in its entirety. Absent also testified that a large television was missing from Inika's living room, as well as a folder that contained certain sensitive information, including Absent's medical records. I want to point out here that medical records could include information like your personal identification number, full names, addresses, and any other information someone would need to know if they wanted to commit fraud on your name, such as transferring your car into their name. A man took the stand and testified that he had obtained a Nokia Asha cell phone from Simelane, but that by the time police asked him about this in September of 2016, he was no longer in possession of the phone. The next person to take the stand was Marina Sambo. Marina was employed by Simelane and his girlfriend as a domestic worker. For those listeners across the pond, domestic workers in South Africa are usually cleaners. Where other countries might have maid services that you can hire to clean your home regularly, South Africans tend to employ domestic workers. These are usually black women, and while we have laws requiring them to be paid a decent minimum wage, this is not always the case. The reason for this is that while the majority of domestic workers are black women, the majority of those black women are not South African, but rather from neighboring countries like Malawi. And then a majority of those immigrants are here illegally. This means that domestic workers are often underpaid, since if they report this, they face deportation and being banned from the country. This also means that domestic workers are usually required to do more than just cleaning the home. Childcare is normally expected to be a part of their duties. While I have no information on Marina's nationality, it is clear that she was required to clean and look after Simelane and his girlfriend's children. Marina testified that Simelane had brought Inika's car to her home, asked to store it there, and that both he and his children had told her that he had purchased the car. She also testified that Simelane had told her that he had purchased the car from a Mr. Ndlovu. Interesting that Mr. Ndlovu's sensitive information went missing from the same home as the car. These testimonies again confirmed three facts. Simelane had known Inika and Innocent. They had both been in good health until meeting with Simelane and being provided with a mixture to consume by him. And lastly, that Simelane was in possession of Inika's car the day after her death. Once again, the pattern had repeated. After hearing from the witnesses, it was time for the two trials within this one. The first trial pertained to Mandla's murder and included two statements that Simelane had made and the pointing out exercise that had been conducted in connection with the case. On the pointing out exercise, Simelane showed officers where he had mixed the muti that he had eventually given Mandla and had then taken them to a mountain near his home. Here, he pointed out where Mandla had died, as well as the pit latrine where Mandla's body was hidden and eventually found. The statements he made was towards a police captain and a magistrate. During the trial, Simelane claimed that prior to the pointing out exercise and making the statement, that he had been assaulted by the officers, but the assault included the use of a pipe, and that the officers had coached him on what to say and where to point during the exercise. During these statements, Simelane told the officer and magistrate that Mandla's wife Sibongile had been the one to consult him, that she had asked for his assistance in obtaining muti that would allow her to control her husband and use his money. He also claimed that Sibongile would have paid him 18,000 rand, or about $1,000, as well as given the car and paperwork needed to file a change of ownership for the car. Simelane claimed that Mandla and Sibongile had gone to him on the 20th of February 2014, which is the day that Mandla's body was discovered. He claimed that on this day he provided Sibongile with this muti, and then instructed them to go up to the mountain. He then accompanied them there. When they reached the mountain, Sibongile gave Mandla the muti, and after a while she called to Simelane and told him that Mandla had fallen down. When he inspected Mandla, he saw that Mandla was already deceased. Simelane then claimed that this is when Sibongile came up with the idea of hiding Mandla's body in the latrine pit. It's at this time I would like to remind you of two things. First is the phone call Sergeant Sithole received from Simelane, resulting in a meeting with him, which, when attempting to testify to, the judge halted the testimony until it could be determined whether or not it is admissible. The second is the fact that Sibongile was asked to participate in a lineup, and Simelane was unable to identify her. The judge found that there was not enough evidence that Simelane was in any way assaulted or trained on what to say or where to point. I agree with this for one reason. If officers were assaulting Simelane, especially with a pipe, there would be physical evidence of it that he could show his lawyers, who then would have been able to immediately take action upon this. Simelane did argue that he was not properly informed of his right to legal representation, but the judge found this claim to be unsubstantiated. What also doesn't make sense to me is that if officers were training him on what to say in order to fabricate evidence against Simelane, then why would they get him to implicate Mandla's wife? And if they are attempting to implicate her, why did they not ensure that he successfully identified her during the lineup? Either way, the pointing out exercise and statements made by Simelane and Sergeant Sithole's testimony by extension were all allowed to be entered as evidence. The second trial within a trial was regarding a statement and a pointing out exercise relating to Themba Twala's murder. In this pointing out exercise, Simelane showed police officers where Themba had died, where his car had parked, and the route they walked between the car and the river. The statement Simelane had made included him saying that he left Themba in the river, and when he returned to the river, he found that Themba had passed away. Fearing he might be implicated in Themba's death, he left him there and took the car. Again, Simelane claimed that he was assaulted and trained on what to say and where to point. And again, the judge found the evidence permissible and rejected Simelane's version of events pertaining to his alleged assault by officers. Before the judge made his final ruling on the case as a whole, Simelane took the stand and testified in his own defense. We'll break this testimony up per case again, starting with Themba. Simelane told the court that yes, he did indeed know Themba, but Themba was one of his patients, and that he had seen Themba the morning of his disappearance. He told them that Themba had met him at his home, where he ran his so-called practice from. There, Themba requested assistance in dealing with his enemies. To assist Themba, Simelane had sprinkled an incense-like substance over hot coals on the ground. He then covered Themba with a cloth so that he could inhale the smoke. After this, he made a muti mixture, which he then gave to Themba to bath with, and instructed Themba to change his clothing, while providing Themba with new clothing to wear. He and Themba then got into Themba's car and drove to a nearby river, where he instructed Themba to bathe with a muti. Simelane then claimed that he had left in Themba's car while Themba was left to bathe in the river. His explanation for this was that Themba owed him money, and that the two of them had made an arrangement that Simelane would retain possession of the car until Themba paid him. So, he left Themba there and took the car to his aunt's house. What bothers me about this version of events is that according to his own aunt and the neighbor that Simelane was friendly with, Simelane immediately claimed that he had purchased the car. He also, upon hearing about Themba's passing from his family, lied about where the car was and did not say anything about their agreement to the family. Aside from that, the story changed several times. When the family spoke to Simelane, he acted like he knew nothing. During the investigation, he had two stories. One was the statement he made in which he said that when he returned to the river, he had found that Themba had died. The second was during the pointing out exercise, where he claimed to have watched Themba die. And then, in court, he claimed to have not been present or had any knowledge of Themba dying. This was the entirety of his testimony about Themba. Next, we have Mandla. This was a rather interesting testimony. As we've already covered, Simelane had previously accused Mandla's wife, even going as far as having to, and failing to, identify her from a lineup and saying that he assisted her in concealing Mandla's body. This time, however, Simelane testified that while he knew Mandla as one of his clients, that he did not see Mandla on the day that he had died, but he had never met Mandla's wife before, and that he had never made muti for her to give to Mandla. I could not find any information on what explanation he gave for being in possession of Mandla's car, but since he was not found to be in direct possession of a car, but instead the car was simply connected to being in his possession at the time, it is possible that he simply denied having the car and that those saying that he did was lying. His testimony on Pullen was quite similar. He told the court that he had met Pullen when he was referred to him through another sangoma, but that he had not treated Pullen, that he had no idea how Pullen had died, and that he was only in possession of Pullen's car because Pullen had lent it to him for a week. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of anyone lending their car to someone like a doctor or a priest or something along those lines whom they have just met. In fact, most people make a point of not lending out their car to someone that they've only recently met. There's also another problem with Simelane's testimony. Pullen was discovered near a river and with a plastic container next to his body, quite similar to how Themba had passed away. Finally, in regards to Inika and Innocent, Simelane again had a very simple version of events. He admitted that Inika had spoken to him on the phone that day and invited him to her home. He admitted that on previous occasions he had visited her house and she had visited his. He claimed that while he was at her house on the day that she died, she told him that there were people who wanted to take her car and kill her, but she had asked him to take her car somewhere else for her. He claimed that he had been made muti for her, which had been sprinkled around her home. After that, he claimed that Inika had given her car keys to him, and that was when he left them right there and parked the car at his domestic worker's home. According to him, he did not give Inika or Innocent any muti to drink. And that was Simelane's version of all the deaths that he had been connected to. Judge Rulofse, who was presiding over the case, now had the difficult job of deciding whether or not the state had proven that all these cases were suspicious enough that the only explanation would be that Simelane murdered all these people. Judge Rulofse provided commentary on each case before making his final findings. During these comments of his, he categorically brought up the discrepancies in Simelane's version of events, the multiple versions he provided, and then he outright rejected all of Simelane's versions. He says that the state had proven a similar modus operandi in each death, and that Simelane's explanation each time for why he was in possession of a dead person's car was improbable, and then he rejected them all as lies. Judge Rulofse proceeded to say that if each of the murders were viewed in isolation, that there may be doubts about whether all the elements of murder had been proven, especially in light of some of the autopsy reports, but that by evaluating the cases in totality and as a whole, including Simelane's explanation, but logic dictates that there can be no doubt whatsoever that all the deceased had died at Simelane's hand. The judge also said that he not only believes that the murder weapon had been a poisonous concoction made by Simelane, but that the motive for each murder was theft of their vehicles. In the end, Simelane was found guilty on all charges. On the 17th of January 2020, he was sentenced to 4 life sentences on the 4 counts of murder, 15 years for each count of robbery, and 10 years for the attempted murder of innocent. In researching this case, there was something that kept lulling around in my mind. We know that serial offenders tend to escalate their attacks. Their first attempt at taking a life almost never succeeds perfectly, and there is usually a steep learning curve that sees them correct their methods to fine-tune them and ensure that their victims do not survive or escape. In this case, however, it seems like Simelane just decided to take a life one day out of pure greed. It worked out perfectly, and he continued in the exact same manner, even taking a year-long break in between some of the victims. There is no evidence that there were any other victims. I am certain that after discovering how Simelane had been operating, that officers would have asked those close to him about any other vehicles or other high-value possessions that he may have suddenly obtained over the years. And it truly seems like those around him would have said something, since some of them actually testified against him. The year-long break between Pullen and Enika's murders also bothered me. It's not common for serial offenders to take that long break. But when Simelane offended again, he had escalated by attempting to murder 2 people and by stealing more than a car. In the end, it is possible that Simelane had been driven to kill by greed, and not by a desire to kill like other serial killers. This would explain why he operated differently than the other serial killers we know. But the thought remains. If he had managed to conceal his skills so well that they were not discovered until someone survived, could there be more victims out there who he was simply not connected to, just because he was never caught in their cars? Simelane had managed to remain so far under the radar that for 3 years he had run into the police on multiple occasions, but not once did the police suspect that they might be dealing with a serial killer. His victims have been reduced to nothing more than notches on his belt. Their stories have been lost as background noise in his. Their legacy? Be careful who you trust. Henry Themba Twala, Samuel Mandla Sitole, Pullen Henry Mshlongo, Kosha Inika Ndlovu. May your souls rest gently. Innocent, may you heal from the tragic events you had to survive, and may you have a long and happy life. And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of episode 4. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.